Well, I didn't grow up in church. Some of you know I grew up in a non-religious Jewish home, and my first church experience was actually a youth group experience, and it's worth noting this is back in the 80s, and this is the last century, okay? And back then, youth group was not as cool as it is today. I think some of that just has to do with kids are cooler today. Everybody's got a phone, everybody's on Instagram, every kid's on TikTok, everybody's using words like lit and bruh, and everybody looks cooler than I do, and I recognize that makes me sound uncool or sound pretty old. I get that, but it's worth noting youth group back in '88. If you were alive back then, you remember youth group was not cool. One of the other reasons is because of the songs that we sang. And most of the songs that we sang in youth group had hand motions. Anybody remember that? If you were alive in '88, I'm just curious. Just lift up your hand. Alive in '88, okay. If you were alive in '88 in youth group, there was this one song that somehow fit into the worship category. I don't know how, but it was a song entitled "I've Got the Joy." Anybody remember that song? It sounds more like a diagnosis, really, where, it's like, what happened at the doctor? Well, he says, I've got the joy. 3 rounds of antibiotics, I think maybe he's going to knock it out. Yeah, it was a song, though, and the way it went is, I've got the joy, 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 joy. Yeah, down in my heart. Yeah, thank you. Wow. I feel like we're going to just bring that back. Yeah, I've got the joy, 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 down in my heart, down in my heart, down in my heart, down in my heart. Right? So, and it had these hand motions a little bit like YMCA. Do you remember that? Of course, my youth pastor thought YMCA was satanic, but because Jesus wrote this song, the hand motions are sanctified. I don't understand it. We sang it every week in youth group, and interestingly, it did not bring joy to me. It was, you cannot find a 16-year-old on planet Earth that's like, I love hand motions. I mean, maybe T Swift's going to bring a hand motion song, and that'll kind of, bring a resurgence to hand motions. I don't know. But did not love this song. But what it did do, when I finally became a Christian, when I began to follow Jesus, I realized that joy is designed to be the centerpiece of the Christian life. We are made for joy. It's part of our inheritance, really, as sons and daughters of God. This is the conversation we started last week, if you weren't here, and we're just simply titling these talks, Fighting for Joy. Fighting for joy. And the heart behind this is that we're not hating on happiness. I mean, like, everybody wants a little slice of happiness, right? But what we have to do is name it. And we just have to name that happiness is elusive. Happiness is really predicated on circumstances going our way. And of course, we all want a little bit of that. But joy is different. Joy is a supernatural reality of you and I experiencing gratitude, because the gratitude is anchored to an unchanging circumstance called the grace of God and the future grace of God. And what that does is then it gives us strength to stand in the most painful circumstances of our life. That's how the Bible would define joy. Now, we don't have time for this today, but there is an entire book in the New Testament about joy. Anybody? We'll do a little Sunday school action. Anybody want to shout that book out? Philippians. It's called the book of Philippians, and it's all about joy. Thank you, that one lone voice in the back. We're grateful for you. The book is called Philippians, and the premise of the book of Philippians is that joy that is most profoundly expressed is almost always going to have the backdrop of pain to it. And I know that because the guy that writes the book of Philippians, a guy named Paul, Paul's in prison. Paul has lost everything. Everything has been taken from him. Death is knocking at his door. And we read Philippians today, and we're like, okay, he's in prison. Prison equals no joy. And Paul's like, no, you don't understand. The joy I'm talking about, the joy that is available to every son and daughter of God, that kind of joy, it is anchored to an unchanging reality called the resurrection of Jesus. And then the Spirit of Jesus fills us up in such a way that you and I can face the worst moments, the most unhinged places in our life, and we can do it with a strength that keeps us standing in spite of any circumstance. Now, here's the thing. You have to fight for that kind of joy. You and I do not drift into that kind of spiritual reality. We have to fight for it. Because if we just drift, we're always going to drift into apathy. We're going to drift into lies about ourselves. We're going to drift into lies about God. And this is why in the human condition, one of the things that we all do, no matter where you are, with Jesus today, the human condition is we're always going to insulate. We're going to spend a bulk of our time, our money, our resources, our energy insulating our life from pain. I mean, think about where you live. You're like, okay, I want a gated neighborhood, and I want to put my kids in this particular school, and I want to get a higher paying job, and then I want to get higher education, and then I want to work out. And all of that, if we just be honest, all of it is a kind of insulation from pain. But what we also have to name is that there is an unseen spiritual conflict happening all around us. And the leader of that spiritual conflict is the enemy of your soul. And given the right moment, and inevitably that spiritual conflict will get over the walls of your insulation, over the walls of whatever you've built up to keep yourself safe, and it will get in and it will mark you. And if you are not found to be fighting for joy in the moment, the enemy of your soul will come in and he will pilfer what little joy you actually have. So we have to fight for it now. For those of you that are in beautiful circumstances, and congratulations, God bless you, really. If you are in a season where you're like, everything's going great, sun is shining, metaphorically, I've got the job, just got married, moving to a new house, my health's great, everything is looking up, God bless you. This is the time you really need to fight. This is the time before it's too late. You've got to dig deeper wells of joy and self-reliance, not on yourself, but reliance on Jesus. And those of you that are in terrible, painful seasons in which you feel more frail, more weak than you ever have before, it's going to be easier for you to dig wells because everything's been taken from you. And the wells that God's inviting you to dig are wells of joy, wells of dependence on Him. Let me show you what I mean. Paul, the guy that wrote Philippians, he also wrote a book called Galatians. I want to unpack a couple verses. He says this is Galatians chapter 5. He says, this is verse 16. He says, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other. In other words, there's the Spirit of God who rules all things, and then there's the spirit of our flesh, and then there is the enemy. And what Paul's saying is, like, ultimately in your life, the Spirit of God or your flesh is going to win out somewhere in your life. And so he says, so that you are not to do whatever you want. So if the Spirit of God's at work in your life, he's like, so you're not going to do whatever you want to do. You're going to do what the Spirit wants to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. And now what he's going to do, just in a minute, he's going to describe what a life looks like that is ruled by self. And we don't really need a description because that's most of our lives at certain times in our lives. But he's like, let me paint a picture for you what a life of self-reliance really looks like. And so here's a big list. Well, should be up there. There it is. I want you to notice verse 20, though. We're not going to read all those, but I do want you to notice the ones in bold, because he's like, this is a life that is a life ruled by self. And I want you to notice jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition. All the others are like, yeah, of course. Witchcraft, absolutely. But he's like jealousy, rage, selfish ambition. The reason I want to highlight those is because those are the ones that we've normalized. Those are the sins that we've said, those are absolutely okay. And that's how you know it's a life ruled by self, where you begin to make room for your sin. Where we begin to create margins for our own selfishness, for our own ambition. And then what he's going to do is he's going to move on now, and he's going to show us what a life looks like that's ruled by the Spirit. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit, now we use this language like outside of church, like the fruit of something, meaning the result of something. So he's like, just imagine you're in relationship with the Spirit of God, and the fruit of being in relationship with the Spirit is love, joy, there's our word, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Let me just hit on that last phrase. Against such things, there is no law. One of the reasons the law exists is because it keeps us from doing things even worse. So you get out on the road, and there are these street signs that say speed limit, 65. And the reason it has a limit is because the law is given because the government knows that if you go beyond 65, then you're going to bring not only greater danger to you, but you're going to endanger other people, right? And so he's like, the law is given to keep you from doing worse. But notice what he says about the fruit of the Spirit. He says, against such things there is no law, meaning there's no boundaries for love. There's no boundary stones for joy. You can keep going and going and going and going with peace. There is an extravagance built in here. There's no governor on the fruit of the Spirit. It's like you go as far and as long and as wide as the Spirit will enable you to. And then verse 24, this is where the money is. He says, those who belong to Christ, and what I want you to pause just for a second, because I don't want you and I to read this and be like, okay, we're just doing a Bible study here. I want you just to ask the question. I want you to be reflective on your own life for a second and ask the question, do you belong to Christ? Because he's about to describe the person that belongs to Christ. So what I don't want you to say is, well, of course, I'm in church. Of course I belong to Christ. That's not what that means. Meaning you've trusted Christ. Christ is the treasure. Jesus is the source. He's who you're abiding in. He's who you're going to. If that's you, he says, those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Meaning, if we're gonna cultivate joy and grow joy in our spiritual garden, then some other things have got to die. Do you know what has to die when you cultivate joy? How about self-sufficiency? How about your own selfishness? How about you getting your way all the time? Do you know what has to die most of the time for joy to grow? You have to die. I have to die. And then he goes on and he says, since we live by the Spirit, let us now keep in step with the Spirit, which sounds a lot like John 15, if you were here last week. John 15, Jesus is like, okay, if you'll abide in me, I'll abide in you. If you'll remain in me, I'll remain in you. If you'll just stay with me, stay connected to me at all cost, I'm going to do something in you that you couldn't even imagine. So there's this inseparableness to our relationship with God. He's like, I'm in you, you're in me, there's no getting around it. And he says, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. And I'm honestly, I'm not sure there's a more deadly arrow to the fruit of joy than the ugliness of envy. Like if you want to take the shears and cut off that big bundle of fruit in your life, then the way to do that is just to make life about you. Like every post about you, every conversation you weave it back to you, every complaint's about you, everything's like that is the fast track to misery. In fact, some of you, you're already there and you're like, oh, that's why I'm miserable. I've made life about me. But let's go to John 15, and this is where we're going to make the turn. He says this, John 15, verse 5, and I know we were last week, but we just didn't get finished. He says this. This is Jesus speaking. He says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Okay, so this is a picture of a vineyard. I don't know if you've ever been to a vineyard. Amy and I, we had the privilege of being in Florence, Italy a few years ago. We got to spend an entire day at a vineyard. It was amazing and beautiful. And you walk through these rows, and there are these trellises. And they look different in different landscapes, depending on the grape. So you got these trellises, and the trellis is holding up the weight of the vine. I know we're in the deep south. We think vine, we think kudzu, and it's this invasive species, and it covers and kills everything. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about a wine-bearing vine, a vineyard. Okay, and in fact, I think there's a picture here, and the picture of the vine, it might surprise you, is there's this massive trunk at the bottom of the trellis, and it grows up, and it gets a little bit thinner as it goes up, and then about halfway up, these branches come off the vine, and off the branches are where the fruit comes from. And Jesus is like, okay, I'm the vine. I'm this massive trunk that goes into the ground, and there's this beautiful root system going into the Father. And then as I grow up, I'm going to produce branches, and you're the branches. And if you'll remain in me, the vine, I'm going to remain in you. And if you'll remain in me, if you remain in me and I'll remain in you, then you'll bear fruit. Or to say it a different way, he's like, if the Holy Spirit's sap is flowing through you, then the thing that you're made to do, the thing that you long to do, which is produce the fruit of joy, that will happen. Or to say it a different way, the fruit, it flows from the root. There's no other way. Meaning, if today you have you hear what I'm saying, you say, okay, this is about pursuing joy. No, this is not about pursuing joy, and the reason is you cannot produce fruit in your life. That is an impossibility. The only way that fruit is produced is by the work of the Holy Spirit. By you and I abiding and remaining in the vine, then the sap of the Holy Spirit grows up in us, and God himself grows the fruit. Or to say it even a different way, it's not pursuing joy, it's pursuing Jesus. And I don't know how we can say it any differently. We say this almost every week. Friends, it really is about just being with Jesus. It is not about checking this box about coming to church. It is not about, I'm in a small group, or I put a check in the bucket, or, I did all the right things, or I'm more moral than I used to be. Friends, it is about being with Jesus, he's everything. He's everything. I mean, it's the psalmist. He knew what he was talking about in Psalm 63 as they're looking forward to the Messiah coming. It's one of my favorite verses. It says, because your love is better than life. There's not a lot of things that you and I would say, because this is better than my life. No, we're like, my life's the most important thing. I'm going to protect it at all cost. In fact, I'm going to protect it with guns, and I'm going to protect it with high walls, and I'm going to protect it with ugly language. My life's the most preeminent thing in the world. And Jesus is like, no. Your life is designed to be a reflection of my goodness. And so the psalmist is like, because your love's better than my life, he's like, I lay it down. That's the only place that joy really grows. In fact, Jesus says it this way. He says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from you, Jesus, we can do nothing. I mean, that is the Christian life. If you're wondering, like, what's the Christian life? That's it. It's you and I remaining in Jesus, Jesus remaining in us. And so he's like, remain in me, abide in me. I'm going to do something in you that you couldn't do on your own. So if you're walking in misery today, the goal isn't to fight misery. The goal is to pursue Jesus, to say, I'm going to be with Jesus, long to be with Jesus, be satisfied in Jesus. And in doing that, Jesus is like, I'll produce joy in you. It's this supernatural exchange that he does in our life. And then verse 6, he says this. He says, if you do not remain in me, so here's the consequence. If you don't remain in Jesus, he's like, you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. So it's just a reminder that every branch in your life is going to get tended to. You know why? Because we have a Father who is the gardener of our garden. He is the gardener over our vineyard, of which we are in. And he's like, I'm going along your life, and I'm checking out. Just imagine he's walking in that vineyard that you saw a moment ago, and he's checking every branch. Because he's there to see if there's fruit. And he's checking every branch. And the branches that are not bearing fruit, you know what he does? He lops off those branches. He's like, it's not good for anything. It's a distraction. And he's like, I'm going to throw that branch into the fire. And then what's equally painful, and if you're a new Christian, this may be a new idea for you, but what he's going to go on and say is he's like, but when I find branches that are bearing fruit, where you get to this branch and there's all these grapes on it and all these things that have been produced because they're centered on the vine, what the what the vine dresser does, what the gardener does, so crazy. After the fruit has been produced and has been cultivated and taken off the branch, then the gardener comes along and he cuts that branch back, which is super painful. And he cuts it back because he's like, this is a branch that is bearing fruit. I'm going to cut it back so that it will bear much fruit or more fruit in the next season. And that's the word for some of you. I really believe that, because some of you, you're looking at your life right now going, man, I'm looking at some of the branches of my life and they are getting decluttered right now. And God's like, yeah, I'm decluttering those. I'm pruning them back so that I can give you more space to remain in me. I've got friends who are like on the verge of retirement or are retired, and they're like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I'm like, oh, I know exactly what you're supposed to do. I mean, wouldn't it be amazing? I mean, all of us that work like crazy hours, which is most of us, and at the end of the day, we're like, oh, God, I wish I would have just spent more than, those 38 seconds praying in the car to work. Like, God, I wish I had more time. And then we get retired, and we're like, what am I going to do? And what we do is then we give our life to really small things. We waste the last 20 years of our life. We waste it with golf or picking up seashells or going on dumb trips. And I'm not saying all that stuff's not helpful to be in community and have fun, enjoy this life. But some of you are in a season where He has pared back your life, and you're like, it feels like discipline, and God's like, no, it's a gift to you. Use it to cultivate a deeper relationship with me. That's where the deeper wells of joy come from. Last verse, he says this, verse 8. He says, this is my Father's glory. I love that. What came to mind when I was getting ready for today was, if you have kids, when your kids were younger and you put them to bed, and then maybe an hour later you go into their bedroom, you open the door, and the light from the hallway, comes into their bedroom, and you see them sleeping there, and all of a sudden there's this love that comes over you. Mostly because you're like, they're not arguing with me, and they are obeying because they're sleeping. But you open it, and does that happen with you? Where you look at them and you're like, I love them so much. I cannot imagine loving another human being more than this little scoundrel. I can't imagine. This is what he's saying. He's like, it's the Father's glory. When he looks at you, he's like, I love you so much. Like, you might be in a space in your life where you're like, I am a dumpster fire. I've been walking into disobedience. I'm telling you, in a spiritual way, God opens the door of your room, and he looks and he's like, you're my glory. There's nothing you can do to outrun my love for you. I love you so much. And so he's like, this is my Father's glory. Don't miss this. That you bear much fruit. Do you know why he's like, it's my glory that you bear much fruit? Because he's like, you're doing the thing you're made to do. I've got grown kids now, and I'm telling you, they're not in the service, so I can say this. I've got more angst over my grown children than I've ever had over when they were young. And not because they're bad children, they're amazing children. But now I'm like, God, I want them to do something that makes them come alive. I want them to have a vocation. I want them to spend 40 or 50 hours a week for the next 40 years doing something that's going to give you glory. That they're going to come alive, that they will love. And when I see them doing things that doesn't do that, it's not glory, it's ache. And God's like, it's my glory when I see you do the thing you're made to do. So he says, this is my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit. So he's like, I love it when you bear fruit. You're made for this. Showing yourselves to be my disciples. Okay, so let me finish this way. The latest data shows the average American right now spends a minimum of 3 hours a day recreationally on their phone. That equals, I don't know how they got this data, but it equals the average American touching their phone 2,600 times a day. 2,600 times a day. Some of you are like, I'm already ahead. I'm already ahead of the game. It's 4 or 5 hours recreationally, lots of TikTok, lots of YouTube. This isn't like checking my email or, checking the spreadsheet for work. This is like going to the phone for pleasure. And what the research, these are not Christian researchers. This is like just sociological data. They're saying the reason this is happening is every time we touch the phone, actually it's a little shot of dopamine. And who doesn't love a shot of dopamine? But the first part of that word is dope. And I don't mean like it's dope, but it's dope. It hooks. In fact, what they say is that after touching your phone 2,600 times a day, it's the equivalent of a snort of cocaine. It's the equivalent of 24 hours in front of a slot machine. And so they're saying it's rewiring our brains in the most unhealthy ways. And we all know this. Like, you don't have to be a sociologist to be like, yeah, I think that's probably true. Every time we get on our phone, some of you have looked at your phone like 100 times already today in this service. And you're like, oh, look at these new sandals. Or, somebody responded and, commented on my TikTok video. Or, somebody responded to my email. And there is this little dopamine hit because somebody has responded to us. And the researchers, this is unashamedly, like the reason people are doing this is they're searching for happiness. These are sociologists. But what they're noting, it's actually not creating a culture of happiness. And we all know this. The more we're on the phone, we're actually more anxious than we've ever been. We're more depressed than we've ever been. Now here's the irony to this talk. Nobody's going to leave this building today after this sermon and be like, you know what? I've got more joy after that. And the reason there's not a dopamine hit with this. But what will happen if you'll fight for joy is that you'll begin to realize that the only way that joy is cultivated is it's a day after day after day of abiding with Jesus, of remaining with Jesus. The only way that you cultivate Spirit-filled joy is in the soil of surrender, daily.